Breakfast.
BBC Radio London.
Approaching 7:10. Good morning, it's Breakfast on BBC Radio London. Our ministers have outlined plans to ban the sale of new leasehold flats in England and Wales. The government said a new system known as Commonhold would allow homeowners to take to own a share of the building and give them greater control. Housing Minister Matthew Pennycook says reform would put an end to unfair practices and unreasonable costs at the hands of landlords. Sebastian O'Kelly is director of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, who advise leaseholders about the system, and joins us now. Good morning, Sebastian.
Hi there.
Happy Monday, pal. I've got so much to talk about on this, but what doesn't work about this system? What is it about the system that doesn't work for you?
Gosh, just about everything doesn't work. I mean, you have a management that's imposed on you by a landlord. The landlord is often an anonymous person, usually or frequently based offshore, hiding behind nominee directors. So you have no idea why you're being pushed around or by whom. And the person who's pushing you around gets loads of insurance commissions on the building, appoints the management of the building, gets his legal costs in any dispute about the financing of the building, and is generally in a hugely powerful position, even though the value of his investment in the building is probably 1 to 3% the total value. The rest of the value of the building is all in the flat of the very people being pushed around. So it's a nonsense, the system we've got at the moment, and it's very welcome we're going to Commonhold like the rest of the world.
It's a very antiquated system, isn't it? Leasehold.
It's very antiquated, and it just supports the money. And house builders have been in on the act. Lawyers have been in on the act, not telling their clients how disastrous some of these leasehold contracts are. Don't forget that it was PLC house builders that introduced leasehold houses around the country with no justification whatsoever, and introduced 10-year doubling ground rents, which meant that the properties were completely unsellable. That wasn't just some spiv picking up a freehold in the auction. It was a publicly quoted house building company, which incidentally taxpayers subsidise hugely. So it's been a complete rip-off by the residential property industry, and it was ended. And so I really congratulate Matthew Pennycook for advancing this, and I look forward to the legislation.
It's a really weird one, because I mean, if you go around parts of northwest London and other sort of suburbs of London, you will have houses that were converted into two flats at one point, maybe around the 70s or the 80s, and they effectively become leaseholds, because at the end of the day, no one person can own the freehold of the property unless it goes into a company, and it all becomes quite convoluted legally. Leaseholds were it's a really weird one then, because I kind of researched into it. You don't actually own the bricks. It's something to do with air and stuff like that. It's a very convoluted policy. But tell us what ground rents mean, service charges, responsibilities with regards to leaseholds, and who has to do what effectively.
Well, I mean, you've just mentioned a really good point, and there's an example of a fellow who lived in a maisonette in North London, and he reorganised the kitchen of his flat. The person downstairs owned the freehold and complained and took him to court. He ignored the court. In the end, he lost his entire flat, which was 600,000 quid, to the neighbour downstairs. So that shows how powerful these laws are if you get on the wrong side of them. And you can get onto the wrong side of them for just the reasons you've just mentioned, by not paying the ground rent, never, ever not pay the ground rent, and not paying the service charges. And I would advise, don't ever refuse to pay the service charges unless you're being legally advised. Usually what we would say is pay these ridiculous charges, then fight them in the courts, having paid them, and get them knocked back. Once you've done that, you're not at risk of getting hit by the unfair legal cost regime of leasehold, because a landlord will always get his legal costs, and the leaseholders will never get their legal costs in a dispute. So it's a completely unbalanced system, weighted towards the money and to the detriment of consumers, and it's good that time has been called on it.
What happened to the old school peppercorn ground rent?
Well, that still exists in some flats, but of course peppercorn means zero monetary value, and so anyway, you can't introduce ground rents at all now, thanks to the Act, which my organisation promoted hugely in 2022, the Leasehold Reform Ground Rents Act, which has ended the ability to introduce new ground rents, but there's still a lot of nasty ground rents around. The old peppercorn ground rent is just a way of the powerful people to keep a control of your home, even if the monetary value that they're getting out of it is very, very small. But actually, you don't need this third-party landlord at all. And nobody in Western Europe puts up with this, or in North America, or in Australia or New Zealand or South Africa. It's all been ended. Commonhold is the default system of flat ownership around the world, except for England and Wales, and it's just a nonsense, and it needs to end.
Okay, so moving on from that, what does Commonhold mean, and what could it mean for homeowners?
Okay, well, what Commonhold means is that you own the building and you own the land along with your neighbours, and you're all responsible for maintaining the building. And if you don't maintain the building, then it will fall in value, and so will the value of your property fall. And if you're a shambles and can't get the organisation together, then it is obviously very unfortunate. But there will be squabbling with Commonhold between neighbours of whether to spend money on a new roof or repaint the lobby and all this sort of thing. There'll be squabbling, but that's in a different league to being an offshore landlord who's simply hoovered up a freehold and is squeezing it to make as much money out of this as possible. There's a very good example at Chelsea Bridge Wharf, actually, which is a very fancy development of flats next door to Battersea Power Station, right on the river. And it's 1,100 flats. And 2 weeks ago, it went right to manage. But here's the thing, the really interesting thing about this is the Berkeley Group, which built the site and owns the freeholds, agreed to the leaseholders having right to manage. And this means the Berkeley Group has seen the writing on the wall that flat owner empowerment is the way to go, and that's why it didn't resist this application for right to manage, and has let the flat owners appoint a professional property manager of their choice, and to run the blocks in the interests of all the residents who live there.
Okay, so if Commonhold prevails, will this create a two-tiered system between those who are currently living in leasehold flats and those who will be able to buy Commonhold ones in the future?
I think that this is a bit of lobbying from the freeholder organisation, a two-tier system. Well, what do we want to do? Do we want to keep the the system we've got with all the rip-offs that I've just stated? Of course not. Commonhold is being advanced because leasehold has failed. It has demonstrably failed. If you introduce an improved system of flat ownership and people have the older version of flat ownership, then you've got the two-tier. But Australia introduced Commonhold in the early 1960s, and it took some time to work through the system, and virtually all private flats now are Commonhold. There's very little leasehold in Australia indeed. People will see the benefit of cost control when the people who are paying the bills and are directly affected by the service charges are in charge. We think that when residents are in charge of a block of flats, the service charge goes down about 20%. So there's 20% of fat in the service charge which shouldn't be there, and that's leaving aside the more really dubious things like the loaded insurance costs and other related companies to do services and all the other fiddles that you can get up to with leasehold, which you simply would not be able to do, or an outsider would not be able to do with Commonhold. But I do say it's not a panacea. There will be squabbling between neighbours living in a communal block. They always do squabble, and they will under Commonhold.
Absolutely, they're just all these. There's all this rigmarole and all these different sort of loopholes and bits and pieces with leasehold. Sebastian, really appreciate your insight. Thank you for joining us. That's Sebastian O'Kelly, director of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, who advised leaseholders about the system. Why are we talking about it? Well, ministers have outlined plans to ban the sale of new leasehold flats in England and Wales. The government have said a new system known as Commonhold would allow homeowners to own a share of the building and give them greater control.